Hello, I'm your host, Kayla, and this is Spectra Storytime. Within the world of Spectra lies a land of lost souls seeking solace in whichever places they can find it. Today's story is called Mono No Aware. Like all the tall tales on this channel, this story is from my unpublished short story collection, Spectra. I hope you enjoy. Now, shall we begin? Mono No Aware. Once upon a time, upon many times, a child was born twice. The first birth was to a girl, Jill, with pinched brown eyes sealed tight by the amniotic fluid of which she was coated. Her head was smooth and round, if not slightly oversized on her body, with a crown smeared by a placenta perm of straight dark hair. The second birth, occurring shortly after the first, was to a boy, Jack, a child of the same nature with the exception of his chromosomes and genitalia. After the typical reaction to such a violent and brilliant arrival, the wet sobs and hoarse wails subsided, and finally, both the mother and the children, exhausted by themselves and the other, lay down to rest. The twins nursed contently either breast of their mother, mistaking the comfort of the sensation for that of the shared womb they'd occupied only minutes prior. For a while, time passed as it should. Diapers were soiled, sleep was not missing nor a thief, and toothless first smiles were recorded. Then, of course, the inevitable happened. The twins discovered a degree of separation, learning that they were not, in fact, still cocooned inside the warm embrace of their mother's body. The milk of the world they guzzled down at all hours was not the world at all, but the excretions of a creature with its own sensations and hunger that did not match their own. It was after that daunting realization that they began to perceive things as they were and would be, but hardly ever as they existed now. Jill's first memory was of the feeling of plastic between her pudgy brown fingers, a hot pink bath toy in the shape of an elephant or a seahorse. She still wasn't sure. The toy was hard and inflexible, which made it good for splashing herself and her brother, of whom she also shared the bath. As she slammed it down into the water with her fist, she emitted countless shrieks and giggles. The toy proved reliable in creating the same dazzling result over and over again. It soon grew warmed by the bath water, only to become cold and rough in her soft hands. She no longer held a toy, but a bone, long and heavy and unfamiliar. She would not recognize the nature of the object until much later, in class as she learned about dinosaurs and fossils for the first time. On that day, the memory flickered like a dream she half woke up to, in a haze of steam from a candlelit room, where shapes and colors blurred and merged into all that surrounded them, until nothing was certain anymore. The girl was young enough then to get lost between the dreams of memories and the memories of dreams, and was not altogether very frightened. Not yet, anyway. That would come later. Jack's first memory also emerged from the water. The day was hot and the water was cool in the white paper cone, if not a little artificial tasting from the melted gas station ice in the jug, and he gulped it down greedily as he watched flashes of red and yellow pennies dart along the soccer field. Halfway to the bottom of his third cup, he began to slow his gulps and sip intentionally, appreciating the satisfying weight in his belly and the moisture clinging to the bottom of his lip. Then, faint as the last dregs of summer rain trickling on the pane of his bedroom window, he smelled it. The scent of worms on the wet sidewalk on his sprint to the bus, the dust rising up to meet them, the smell of petrichor. He stopped drinking and looked around frightfully. The soccer turf was still a cheerful green, the sky above it a swath of rich sapphire blue that made him smile the way children do, somewhat amazed and happy to be alive, and the day was as hot and dry as the weatherman had predicted. So where did the smell come from? He eyed his drink suspiciously, regretfully still thirsty. He took a small sip again, just to dip his tongue into. No, it hadn't come from the water that was sour and brown as the dirt that caked his cleats. He dropped the paper cup into the mud, where runoff from the jug had created a puddle. He imagined drinking from the puddle and having the same awful feeling in his mouth, the water tasting the way pond scum smelled. A better word would form later. Pollution. He would not understand how he could possibly know the taste of polluted water, as he'd never drank it before, but he would believe with certainty that pollution was indeed what he'd tasted. He would use this word again, and often, this time to describe his passage through time, or more accurately, time's passage through him. The twins continued their lives in this altered state of consciousness, perceiving transience as all living things do, only out of order. Where other little girls and boys lamented over the discovery of death in an old family dog or fading grandparent, the twins, upon contact with both the dead and the living, could hardly distinguish what separated one from the other. One day, as Jill lay her head down on her pillow to sleep, the sway of reeds brushed against her ears. A sly breeze rustled the cattails nearby in a lake she knew once belonged to the goose that had given its feathers to make the very pillow she lay her head on now. Jill burrowed deeper into the covers, and a rush of brisk, open air made her feel fresh and new as she relived the very last flight the goose would ever know. That night she slept ever soundly, and every night since. Jack, on the other hand, was a very poor sleeper and had once enjoyed reading to pass away the midnight hours. It was not the experience of other worlds he craved. It was what harnessed these worlds that comforted him. The written word itself was a permanent fixture, as ink could not unmake itself, and neither could the ideas they possessed. Yet the more he read, the more he could not ignore the rough scrape of bark against the tips of his fingers as he flipped through the pages, and soon the leather that bound his old books began to pulse with the beat of another. A sun-warmed glow penetrated his skin. Reading with gloves became a necessity, but did nothing to dispel the feeling of moss, soft, spongy little beds sprouting inside the binding. He knew the day would come when the page itself would pass through his fingers in a gritty heap of ash, and it wasn't long before he gave up the hobby altogether. Sometimes his world was not unflinchingly bad. Sometimes he did not live in regret of knowing it. Rooms opened up to him. He saw kitchens pass through time as a bird passes through a window. But the direction of that bird was, either outside or in, he couldn't say. Only that things were neither ever out of place nor in them. The tiles changed from red to blue. The walls brightened and faded. Wood vinyl replaced cherry oak, replaced vinyl once more. Long-haired hippies on shaggy couches merged into cats on expensive glass tables they weren't supposed to perch on. Lava lamps clumped and unclumped beside unchanging mugs of cold coffee and tea. Most of the time, he was unsure of what had come first, which fixture would outlive the other. Only he found that he didn't mind not having an answer. He preferred to stand back and watch as the silhouette of the heart-shaped leaves on the birches outside his window carved new and interesting patterns on the floor that were always changing, in the room that he wasn't entirely sure ever existed. Moments like those he believed he could accept, what he was or what he never would be. Moments like those he lost himself completely. Then there it was again, that unreceding echo. He'd make a new friend on a night out and be welcomed back to their place. A modest apartment or a shared house, the basement of their older brother, somewhere safe in its mundanity. Then he'd sip the drink he'd been offered, smoke a cigarette on the balcony, and have a polite glance around the room he'd been invited into. Rifling through the bookshelves as he made jokes about their literary taste, picking up and setting things down, the personal knickknacks filling space, only to hold a mask and feel a lump of moist clay in his hands. Gray like wet cement coloring his hands, he'd have to hide in the bathroom long enough to come up with an excuse to leave early, to come home to his unmade bed where sleep watched him from its speck on the wall. When he gave people gifts, he could smell the vomit on their breath as they thanked him. The rotten banana peels and eggshells that made up the garbage cans his present inevitably landed. He smelled it, just as his fingers slipped through the gaps in the stitched-up holes of the sweater he gave his sister, feeling the overstretched sleeves and the worn, frayed hem from years of mending yet to come. Jack had asked her never to mention their secret to anyone, especially not each other. He was not foolish enough to think that if he ignored it, it would go away. It was on principle that he wished never to speak of it, that he said and did nothing. If he could not control it, he would not give it the satisfaction of his attention. This force that could not be anticipated nor avoided, that made up as much of his existence as the breaths passing through him. It remained. And then, of course, there was the rain. Always the rain. Jill cried tears that were not her own as it drenched her from head to toe on her way from the stoop of her office to her parked car. With each step, it slipped another finger past the collar of her coat, soggy in her socks and squeaky boots. The fragile bodies the water had once and would pass through, the blood it pumped and evaporated out of, coated her skin, and Jill wept and was rejuvenated. Jack avoided the rain like a leper, the zinging pressure erupting in his ears, on to the scruff of his neck and arms and numbing hands, a great swell of electricity and a cold, wet blanket embrace. As it should have been impossible to grow intimate with the sensation of walking through a cloud, he eventually grew suspicious of all impossibilities, even his own death, or perhaps the finality of such an event. But first and foremost, he was suspicious of love. Like Jack, it too existed outside of the tangible world as it was meant to. Like Jack, it could not be concrete. Did love predate a conscious conception of it, waiting to be discovered just to be put to bed? Was it made up of a singular element, like water, wearing a new form, a new face as it transitioned through time and space? Jack would never answer these questions, but he would discover the degree of which they mattered. It happened on New Year's Eve. Jack and Jill shared a kiss at the stroke of midnight with a woman named Jane. They were both drunk and sloppy and desperate, and Jane had made a bad joke earlier about having a thing for twins. Jill kissed Jane first with passion and only a little too much tongue, and discovered the sensation, other than being very wet and slightly acidic from the Prosecco, was already familiar. She almost immediately had the instinct to pull away, which she determinedly resisted. It was not a typical first kiss. They did not find each other blindly and with relief. Hands did not slide and squeeze on eager hips. One pair of teeth firmly avoided the other. Their lips navigated the other habitually, retracing old patterns with a longing that spoke of a need to simultaneously preserve and escape them. No, it was not a first kiss at all. It was the last. Jill pulled away with a gasp just as Jane stifled a breathy sigh of satisfaction. For once, Jill hadn't perceived anything beautiful she could hold on to. All she'd tasted was an acidic disappointment. Could she risk all that pain for a glimpse at something better, for a glimpse she might not have again? Jill hugged her ribs tightly, stumbling back slightly, an overwhelming need to be alone pushing her towards the door, to where she was not yet sure. The empty street, perhaps, where she might find a bench to breathe and fold neatly, like clothes at the end of her bed. Jack and Jane's kiss followed a similar pattern. The longing and inevitable heartbreak. Only Jack, to his own surprise, did not pull away. Quite the opposite. Jack was relieved. For once, life was certain. Their love would end. He was not concerned with the reason, but rather what had led up to it. Everything else was beyond him. He would love her and lose her and fear nothing because it was inevitable. No matter how hard he might fight to keep her, he could not be blamed for their failure because it was fate. And so why not enjoy it? Why not? If the world would take her from him, he would have her first, and she him. He had tasted it. He had tasted the space they'd inhabit, and the space they'd create upon separation. How he would fill the space and what it promised, he didn't yet know. But it was there, and it was vast and full of promise. Jack pulled Jane closer, tangling his hand firmly in the hair at the nape of her neck. When the time came, he'd let go. But for now, he'd kiss her slow. Thank you. That was Mono No Aware. For more stories from the world of Spectra, please like and subscribe. Bye!